Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
This is the place where we search for the theories and ideas that are going to shape how we see the world over the course of the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years. And one of the things that we are really curious about is people seem to be going a little bit crazy. And we've come to the conclusion that most of the approaches that are being tried institutionally don't seem to be helping. Because if they were helping, the increased rates at which people are going to go see therapists should have made us healthier and better than ever before. But it seems like everybody's losing their minds. And so a Columbia professor reached out to us recently, Dr. Ragy Girgis, who is a neuropsychiatrist who studies schizophrenia. He also studies mass murder. He also studies AI psychosis. And we figured that this would be an excellent platform to have a conversation about what is happening to people and why it seems like the industrial pharmacological machinery can't actually help them.
And it turns out that Ragy and us have wildly different perspectives about the state of affairs, which makes for a really spicy conversation. Again, Ragy reached out to us, presumably because he understood that we are people with strong opinions about things. And this is a really, really interesting and exciting conversation as a result of that.
The conversation's in two parts. In this episode that you're watching right now, we basically go through and we figure out what causes people to break and who are these people that do break? Like, what is the thing that fractures a psyche to the degree that somebody is completely disconnected from the regular path that they were on before the fracture occurred? And once we establish that, the second conversation that we are going to publish later this week, we actually go through and we look to see, are there interventions that are being applied inside the medical field, inside of psychiatry, of psychology, that are actually able to help the people who break the most? Or are we just leaning on crazy treatments that we kind of know don't work, but we have no better way of turning this entire huge chaotic ship around to actually be able to help people and prevent whatever insanity is right now bubbling beneath the surface from bursting out and really, really making it hard to move forward in a good direction as a society, as a people, as a whole?
Spoiler alerts, the treatments don't seem to be working. And part two is super fiery because we recognize and we dig into the statistical reality of that situation and we try to actually imagine what a mentally healthy society would actually look like and what sorts of recourses would be available to people who are slipping through the cracks.
Yeah, because there's a lot of theories that people have where they're like, oh, it's the social media that's making people sick, or it's the guns that are making people prone to just going around and shooting people. But I think that the perspective that Shiloh and I have is that these things are all reflections. The things that happen above the surface are revealing something that is fermenting beneath the surface. And if we don't get at the foundations of that, then we have no hope of actually being able to make any kind of substantive change and create a society where people are less likely to pick up an assault weapon and then just wander into some place and start doing whatever it is that they do.
Absolutely. So part two is super fun. I hope you will come back for that one. Remember, the project is entirely supported by you guys, which is great because we work directly for you. We don't have any external sponsors, and we absolutely plan to keep it that way. The only way that's possible is through the support of our patrons. So maybe you can come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and check it out. Just see what's up over at that community. It's becoming a really beautiful group of people. We're having very smart conversations every Sunday morning, and I would love to meet you over there. By the way, you can keep this project going for as little as 75 cents a week, which is almost nothing. There's a couple other ways you can support the program too. You could pick up a copy of our latest musical record. This is from our band Secretary of Nature. It's also streaming everywhere. You can check it out there. We also have pre-sale copies of our upcoming book about the material basis of physics as we see it in the future. That is called Paradox Lost, and there's a link to that in the description.
And before we get to the conversation, we are going to play you a little snippet of some of the music that we have been working on. But there's one last detail. We run a segment called Paradigm Drift. And so if you have a theory about how something in the world works, it does not have to be science, it does not have to be physics, history, archaeology, sociology, psychology, religion, whatever, you should come present it at Paradigm Drift. The link to sign up for that is down in the description. If your name gets pulled the night that we are recording, you get 60 seconds to present your theory to the world, and then you get interviewed by us, our panelist, and the chat.
Hell yeah. I'm stoked. We're actually recording one tonight. That will be after this episode has come out and everything, but love to see you at the next one. Anyways, enjoy the music and enjoy the conversation with Ragy Girgis.
See you next time.
In each of your children a river, so there's to run dry. Can you really not hear them? It's so hard to believe, but that's so hard to believe.
Do you think that there was a time in human history where we were particularly good at being able to take people that somehow were not able to fit into their lives the way that they wanted to and actually help them? Or do you think that this has always been this infinitely receding horizon where we just kind of look at people and throw whatever we have at them and it doesn't really help that much?
About 20, 25 years ago, I think, an understanding of mental illness was probably at its highest across society. I guess in particular, American society. Now, although, I think the stigma is lowest now and we have overall the most awareness of mental health, the most acceptance of mental health sorts of issues, but there is this, again, opposition or antagonism to many things in mental health, in particular, for example, SSRIs. Like SSRIs, which are antidepressant medications, they've been around for about 30, 35 years, although versions of them, very similar versions of them, have been around for almost at least 60, 70 years now. But these medications have always had their detractors. But I mean, if you just look online and just look through YouTube and type in SSRIs, you will find countless videos of people just vilifying SSRIs, like literally comparing. And again, my perspective as a psychiatrist and as an observant Christian, you will see people vilifying SSRIs and literally saying that SSRIs are from like demons and Satan and evil. It's very bizarre. It's totally unhelpful, and it's getting worse. Again, I think people.
There was some crazy papers, right, that came out that showed that they were wildly ineffective compared to how they were hyped up originally, right? I remember this a few years ago. I'd have to like go searching for it, but I remember it kind of making a bunch of headlines, and I remember actually reading one of those papers at the time as well. Do you remember this?
You're exactly right. A few years ago, a very, very prominent and high impact paper came out. I believe the journal was Molecular Psychiatry, and this was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was basically on the serotonin hypothesis or theory of depression. And this review of reviews basically concluded that serotonin had nothing to do with depression, basically what didn't contribute to depression. And one of the critiques of the paper was that no one's saying that serotonin or abnormalities in serotonin are necessarily the primary pathophysiology of what we call depression. Is that, depression is the serotonergic system is kind of a more final or downstream pathway through which all the other kind of pathobiological mechanisms work. That's why if we, for example, just look at serotonin, we might not always find an abnormality or the abnormality that we expect, whether it's depression or anxiety or impulsivity or anything else, while it still plays a role in all of these different, conditions and considerations.
So there's a lot of pushback against these pharmaceutical solutions, right? And so I think when you talk about people blaming it on demons and supernatural entities and stuff, like they have a lot of ammunition, it seems like. That's all I was trying to point out. Like there's often studies like this that come out that points at sort of the fact that a lot of solutions don't pan out, but when they don't pan out, it really arms everybody, like people with terrible, like even worse ideas about how to treat these situations, right? And that's really an unfortunate piece of
Pharmacology.
I'm trying to come up with words that YouTube's not going to block us for talking about.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
guess
though.
I guess the argument here is that, okay, so we have this thing that people's psyches become dysregulated in various ways. And the reason that I asked about this question of, when were our approaches the best ones is because it seems like it is a really, really difficult thing to take somebody that has somehow become dysregulated and then put them back together again. Because oftentimes people are dysregulated because there's something wrong with their lives. Like, yes, I know that you study schizophrenia, and it's harder to make that argument about schizophrenics, despite the fact that there's all of this weird evidence about the lower prevalence in, traditional societies where somehow schizophrenics can kind of be like modulated by the culture in a way where it's somehow less disruptive. So it's like, even with extreme conditions, it seems like it is possible for circumstances culturally to be shifted that give people comfort. And the argument I think that people are having, whether it's through the language of demons or through the, like the satanic cabals that are pushing globo pharma on
Careful,
people.
Bendabury.
I know,
Yeah, we're gonna have to
sorry.
bleep all this out.
But I think that it is a really real sense that all of these discussions are drawing the contours of a larger disagreement that people are having about what are we doing here? Are we really helping people, or are we just giving them this pharmacological band-aid that lets them perform inside of a system that is actually not working for them?
The issue again goes back to kind of how, I hate to say, but again, how society and our culture is addressing, these all the different components of, in this case, mental illness. So I think the term biopsychosocial was maybe coined or began to be used in terms of the causes of mental illness maybe 30 or 40 years ago, like around 30 years ago when I was in medical school. And that just refers to there being biological etiologies or causes of mental illness, psychological and social. And that's across the board. Even when we talk about, very kind of genetically based illnesses such as schizophrenia. So what's also happened over the past 20 to 25 years, maybe more like 30 or 35, is that we as a society have decided that psychological theory, psychodynamic theory, psychoanalysis, like Freudian theory, everything Freud and everyone wrote about is just kind of not as important. It's infrequently or much less frequently taught, for example, in psychiatry training programs, and we've kind of forgotten how much that contributes. And all psychology and psychodynamic theory is a way of explaining and describing human nature and all these other motivations and dynamics that contribute to how we behave and how we feel. And a lot of this is because people, a lot of them, don't fully understand or really probably haven't read much of Freud or whatever. In the case of Freud, for example, a lot of people think about the psychosexual theory, which is basically, the Oedipus complex, the young male wanting to compete with his mother, for rather to compete with his father for his mother's affection, that sort of thing. So people didn't like that, so they decided to kind of cast Freud off altogether, like as a society, and that's very unhelpful. That's just a matter of us throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater being the psychosexual theory that people don't like very much, and then the baby being all of psychological theory. So like you said, I mean, it's all so relevant and it's totally unhelpful if we just now have, gone to the other side of the spectrum, which is prescribing medications for everything and thinking medications are going to help everything and not considering all the other contributors to mental illness.
Well, the human being has an incredible link between its emotional state and its physiological well-being, for lack of a better word. Like, going back to that same molecular psychiatry study, it didn't show that the SSRIs were ineffective, period. It showed that in more than half the studies they looked at, that there wasn't a difference between placebo for these mild to moderate cases, from what I can tell, of depression. And that's really fascinating. The fact that you can give someone a pill and say you're going to feel better, and they appear to feel better regardless of whether the pill has, the serotonergic activity that is discussed as the causative mechanism of this. That I think that points to something really incredible, actually, which really reinforces the psychosocial element of health and well-being of the mind, right? Because they're not saying that treating people doesn't help them. They're literally saying like you can convince people that they're going to be better now that they're interacting with somebody, a professional who's saying, hey, this will help you. Like that's so profound and interesting, actually, at the end of the day, because it's pointing to the fact that people do need, at least this is one interpretation, one way you could read it. It's pointing to the fact that people do need some path, some authorized path to go down when they feel out of sorts, when they're, when the way that they're emotionally experiencing reality is destructive to their everyday life, right? The question just becomes, how do we go about that? What authority is able to grant them relief? And are we better at that now than we used to be? Back when it was, exorcisms and, I don't know, marital counseling by your priest or something?
Uh, I think we're better off than we were before, but again, over the past decade or two, I hate to keep going back to this. I feel like we've regressed to some degree. What you're describing, and this is in large part because again, we're not paying as much attention to psychosocial considerations. So what you're referring to is, I think, what people would probably most recognizes the quote unquote placebo effect. It's a very important effect. It's not an unimportant effect. It's actually a very important effect. The greater effect is like the placebo effect is part of what we refer to as the expectancy effect. This is, fundamentally in terms of psychodynamic kind of parlance, this is very well understood. This is what we refer to as transference, and which is basically, how like a patient, how a patient kind of the patient's basically relationship with their therapist in the case of a psychotherapeutic relationship. That's basically kind of responsible for the expectancy effect. So I mean, and that's just kind of that was just always part of our training. So we understood that, and much of psychological theory or psychotherapy, especially psychodynamic psychotherapy, for example, that developed by Otto Kernberg, for example, is based exclusively on that effect or on transference. It's like the whole therapy is based on transference. It's such a powerful technique and process. I mean, we're talking about people's emotions, and that's particularly helpful. Again, going back to what you said, Shiloh, especially for people with more mild or moderate, but mostly mild depression or psychiatric illness in general. As you said, medications in all medications within psychiatry, probably in all of medicine, but in general, medications work more in people who have worse illness, like who have more severe depression or anxiety or whatever, and they're not as effective in people who have mild or moderate illness. We convey this using parameters. I guess these would be considered statistical parameters, such as number needed to harm, number needed to treat. But the number needed to treat for most psychiatric medications is about 7. That means you need to treat 7 people with, for example, an antidepressant medication for one to benefit, taking away or subtracting the placebo effect. So that means that'd be like a 14%. That means like 14% of the people you treat with an antidepressant are benefiting just from the medication.
And what do you mean by benefiting, by the way? Like, are they self-reporting that they feel less depressed?
Yeah, most clinical trials now, and for several decades now, use kind of valid and reliable measures of depression or whatever is being measured. So these are pretty objective and reliable measures. So about 14%. Within medicine, that is very good. It's not the highest, but it's very good. And that's pretty much, this number needed to treat of 7 or 14% or whatever is pretty standard for psychiatric medications. Psychiatric medications in general are among the most effective in all of medicine, rather. Despite that there's such a strong psychological component, obviously, to psychiatric conditions, even despite that, or within that kind of consideration, psychiatric medications are among the most effective. For example, the number needed to treat for a stimulant medication is 2. They're among the single most effective treatments in all of medicine.
So my coffee agrees over here.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So you're telling me, like, if I give a bunch of people, like 10 people have headaches, and I give them all Tylenol or something, or sorry, I didn't mean to brand drop there, but I give them like some headache medicine that only 1 out of 7 of them is gonna feel better or worse?
I don't know the exact number needed to treat for acetaminophen. I'm not 100% sure. But to give people a sense, number needed to treat for people with like high blood pressure, like taking blood pressure medications
And those
or
have been a disaster too. I mean, good God, the
yeah.
statins and stuff. Yeah, so maybe that's not a great example.
But those are the most commonly prescribed medications. Those are in like the hundreds.
But okay, hold on a second.
Good.
I think that you are making the case for the people that are criticizing the current state of the art for treatment. Because if I was doing something that had a 14% success rate and
Or 1%?
or a 1% success rate,
Most prescribed of all?
yeah, I would, if I was very honest with myself, I would have to examine my results and be like, I don't think I actually understand what's happening here. And there's some fraction of cases where it does seem to help. But whatever it is that we're doing does not seem to be a generally applicable solution to the problem at hand. And so I think that this is really what I see a lot of frustration with the medical industry right now, which is that there does seem to be a sense where, on one hand, there's an immense confidence. There is this sense that, state of the art treatments, we have the solutions, trust the science or whatever it is. But then when you start to dig into the literature, you do discover that it's perhaps not as robust as we would like it to be for something that we have to place our faith in, because it is unreasonable to place your faith into something that works 14% of the time.
Which is not to say you should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because
Absolutely.
like I literally would have died this winter. Like I had my appendix removed. It was an insane experience, but
Wow.
the healthcare I got was so incredible. It really woke me up to how masterful the current medical structure can be. Like it was the best healthcare experience I have ever had by a country mile in my life. But that's not to say that the whole thing is tuned to perfection on all fronts, I suppose.
Okay, and to wrap this into a point where we can pick it up and we can go, I read the book that you sent us, which is about the sort of analyzing mental illness in the Bible. And I was struck by something, which was the way that the sections and the quotes that you chose to present implied the following. It was basically, the teachings were that if you do not believe in God, you will be struck down with these symptoms of what you, I think, reasonably analyze as being psychosis, mental illness, various diseases, pestilence, like all of these things. And so it seems to me that if we look at the archaic world, then we can see the invention of religion and the motivations for faith as being based in like this spiritual psychological wellness. And as you accurately also said earlier, the idea of this spiritual well-being has been kind of ceded to the idea of pharmacological well-being in the modern age. Because if you look at Freud, if you look at Jung, what they're really doing is they're analyzing the way that the psyche fits into the collective. I mean, Jung more than Freud, but there is this sense that there's a wellness that can only be achieved by going deep into the unconscious, understanding the individual drives, figuring out how those drives clash with circumstances, and then finding ways to alleviate that. And as we lose that language, it seems that what we've done is we've lost some kind of tool that has been in place in one form or another for like 6,000 years or something. And so now we're stuck with this thing of, okay, well, if we have a 14% success rate with pharmacology, what is
Best
this
case.
best case? Like, what is the success rate
Other than stimulants,
other than stimulants?
Yeah.
those work all the time.
Half the time, 50%.
Oh my God.
Like, if my students were passing their exams at a 50% rate, I would probably not be a professor for very long. And so I'm just sort of, I'm trying to really drive at this question of like, okay, we do seem to have some pharmacological interventions that function. And yet, it seems like they function far below the rate at which we would want them to function. And so the critiques of it that are coming from the outside seem to be based in reality, because a 14% success rate is not really something to brag about, right?
Well, I'll address this in several ways. So first of all, in general, I agree with you, and I'm going to address it. Regarding the 14% success rate, that's just the number needed to treat. The success rate is going to be more like 60, 70%. But again, that includes the placebo or expectancy effect or response. So the effectiveness is relatively high. The number needed to treat just specifically addresses how much of the effect is purely the medication versus placebo. So it's still very effective, but I agree, not effective enough.
I mean, I know nothing about this stuff, but from sitting on the outside, if you go from 14% to 60, 70% effective by, uh, regardless of what the substance itself is, it points, at least from where I'm sitting, it just seems like people want to be soothed about their reality. Like they want somebody to tell them that it's going to be okay, that there's a path forward, that I'm here for you. And the fact that they are like, hey, take this little thingy and this little, have this talisman and eat it or whatever it is, and it'll make you better. And the fact that that works just really points to what people need in these situations, or maybe even what got them there in the first place. And I think that is, that line of evidence has to be exploited by, you know, the institutional superpowers, the minds, right? That has to be exploited, because there's no way to ignore how important that element of this mental health picture that we're sitting on. And if the problem is, if the institutional structures don't address that in full force, then of course you're going to get these wingnuts who come in and are just like, well, it's just the demons or whatever, right? Because they have plenty of ammunition if that's not really being attacked, because that clearly is a huge contribution to the solution set.
Sorry, I was laughing because I was imagining somebody doing a placebo-controlled study for exorcisms.
Have you ever seen an exorcism?
Only in the movies.
I would
Yeah.
love to. Have you?
So I've spoken with exorcists, and they would show me videos. They won't allow me. I won't. I mean, I don't know. I shouldn't say exactly why they said I wouldn't be allowed to view any, but I wasn't allowed to view. I asked to
Oh
to
no,
watch
tell
them
us.
like in
You have to
person.
tell us. Why
Yeah,
not?
it's well, yeah. Basically, I was told that if I wasn't allowed to join an exorcism because being an unbeliever in exorcisms, I'd be at risk of being possessed.
Mm.
So I think a lot of these, and this was like an official exorcist. I think he was a genuine person. I think he really believes in exorcism and those sorts of things. And I was able to view videos and pictures and those sorts of things. And I think there might be one kind of, at least one online uh, like video that you can watch of like at least one, certainly of like a real official exorcism.
It's probably like a whole genre on YouTube, honestly.
Yeah, it's
TikTok.
yeah. So I don't know. I think a lot of these people are genuine, and they truly believe in like demon possession in the traditional sense of the word. I think there are other explanations, of course, but
Well,
it's
so what do these exorcisms look like?
Do they work?
in terms of work and look like, well, they kind of look exactly like what they look like in the movies.
Convenient.
And in terms of working, what do you mean by work?
Well, I'd love to talk about that, because that's really at the heart of this, right? Because Nasi kicked this off by asking, when was the high points? And, you know, the question is, the question in the background of all of this has been about the effectiveness of different strategies to deal with people's emotional dysregulation, ultimately, or psychological dysregulation. Um, yeah, what does it mean to work? Like we can even talk about these extreme patients, right? Because we say, okay, it works, but some of these interventions work really well in severe patients. But what does it mean to work for them, right? What does
Sure.
it mean when you hit a schizophrenic patient over the head with Seroquel or something like that, and they're catatonic, but they're no longer obviously hallucinating or causing distress to the people around them. Like, I could see from everybody else's perspective that works, but I'm not sure that the experience that patient's having is particularly pleasant at the same time.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was trying not to be too boring and technical, but I mean, I guess, basically when we examine or we conduct clinical trials in people with schizophrenia or depression or any sort of mental illness, we usually have very valid and reliable rating scales. And so we measure the effects of medications, for example, on a rating scale over time. And the effect has to go down to a greater degree than rather the score on the scale, meaning the number of symptoms or severity of symptoms would go down over time compared to some sort of comparison group, which doesn't necessarily have to be a placebo group, but some sort of comparison group. And we want that effect to be persistent, so last over months and years. We would also measure things like number of hospitalizations over the next 5 years and all those sorts of things. And so, again, antidepressants and antipsychotics are pretty effective in those regards. Again, definitely, don't get me wrong. They're the best we have, but they are far from being kind of ideal. Far from it. Even definitely with regards to efficacy, but even more so with regards to side effects, like adverse effects or, yes, side effects, basically. Very difficult to tolerate these, especially antipsychotics. So, yeah, absolutely, I just want to confirm that. With regards to exorcisms, so a clinical trial of an exorcism would be amazing. I mean, sign me up. That would be like to watch it or conduct it, I mean, to conduct it. But so basically, what you see with exorcisms is that people who are more likely to so we have something like exorcisms in America, which is the flights into health, praying over someone who is like often paralyzed or something like that, and then they get up from the wheelchair and walk, sort of thing. That's essentially what an exorcism is, even like official church sanctioned exorcisms. And I want to emphasize again, I'm an observant Christian. This is actually part of my own tradition, and within my own church, no one believes what I believe. Just to mention that, but either way. So there's a certain character structure that would make someone kind of more uh, likely to respond in a quote unquote exorcism or have a flight into health. This is what we refer to as a how do I describe this? I want to be as less technical as possible. So these sorts of people have so they're I'll use the Otto Kernberg kind of way of organizing character structure. They're basically four. There's the mature level, there's the neurotic level, there's the kind of the borderline level, and then the psychotic level. People in the borderline level have a lot of like mood instability. They have anxiety intolerance, impulse discontrol. So these sorts of people are very they're very emotional and labile. They tend to be very susceptible to 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 um to other people, to what people say. They're very impressionable, impressionistic. These are the type of people who might improve in the context of an exorcism or a direct prayer over them. And basically, what happens is, like they're consistent with their personality, things change very quickly. So they have a flight into health, and almost always that kind of resolves very quickly. So there's no kind of persistent effect of the prayer or the exorcism or whatever.
But presumably, if somebody has some kind of psychological illness, you wouldn't give them an SSRI once and then be like, bingo bongo, you are fine. From here on out, you're just good. It's this consistent thing. And so if we hold it to the same standard, then the hypothetical clinical trial of exorcism would require periodic exorcisms in order to maintain the effect. And so what we're really seeing is, if that is the intervention that is required, that the root of the illness is some kind of fundamental disconnect between the person and their community and their environment. And then this intervention where the entire group gathers and puts all of their attention to them and focuses on healing them. The thing that's happening is really just this reintegration of the fractured person into their larger community. Now they feel connected. And if they're labile, then they walk away, and that effect gradually disperses, and then you need to have some kind of re-upping of the capacity, so to speak.
Yeah, technically, you're correct. That's right. That's a fair argument. Fair argument. except in one case, just again, this is probably overly technical and esoteric, but you are correct. Except in the case of schizophrenia, there is so the most important. So in schizo, in most psychiatric illnesses, yeah, you're right. You have to take the medication or else it won't work. So like having like as so you're right. You would the apples to apples comparison would be having a regular exorcism or attention or whatever that person needs. So that's correct. Except there is an effect with antipsychotic medications in schizophrenia. One of the most important kind of research findings in schizophrenia, psychotic disorders in general, but especially schizophrenia, the primary psychotic disorder, is this concept of duration of untreated psychosis. And that basically, the duration of untreated psychosis is exactly what it says. That's a period of time from when a person first develops a full psychotic symptom to when they first receive an antipsychotic medication. The shorter the time, the better their long-term prognosis, regardless of how much medication they take in the middle. So that's very important. That's not the whole effect. The effect is not huge, it's somewhat small, but is a definite effect. It's been replicated many, many, many times. And so I just want to mention that technical point. But you're right. Otherwise, for the most part, yes, that the intervention has to be kind of continuous. And that gets back to what Shiloh mentioned before about serotonin, and you also, both of you, about serotonin being involved in everything. Serotonin is not necessarily the primary neurochemical involved in depression. There's certainly some other initial biological insult that again eventually affects the serotonin system and then incidentally causes depression. Similar with schizophrenia, dopamine, which is very obviously primary in schizophrenia, may not be that the primary, like the actual primary insult. Dopamine is responsible for many things like impulsivity, reward, uh, motor function, everything. It's certainly downstream. And so you're right. I mean, so you would not expect a medication that addresses dopaminergic abnormalities or serotonergic abnormalities to have kind of a lasting curative effect, basically. And we're not even close to finding cures for these conditions.
Have you ever had a patient that presents with schizophrenia that, you recommend pharmacological intervention for, and they don't pursue that path, but they do seem to have some kind of support network that functionally stabilizes them? Like, have you ever seen people be able to pull through without intervention, or is it always, intervention or utter chaos?
So the short answer is yes.
Hmm.
Short answer is yes, to some degree. You generally need both. With schizophrenia and all mental illness, but schizophrenia in particular, there's there's such a huge spectrum. It's not always black and white. There's kind of like a gray area, and so medications help to some degree, but the I mean, a third of people with schizophrenia don't respond to any medications and are like chronically institutionalized, essentially. And then only a third, even with medications, improve enough to be relatively independent. And then a third improve really well. Full remission is very uncommon. So psychological or psychosocial interventions in general are extremely important, with or without medications. They do help.
Yeah, going back to the lag time thing, that's really interesting in
Mhm.
terms of the lifetime efficacy or whatever it was called. Because in some sense, that's also seems inseparable from the person just making contact with external reality and getting on a path with supportive people, right? Like, it's hard to deconvolve the effect of the drug itself from the fact that this person didn't spend years stewing in their own, uh, hallucinations or whatever and building every time you go to bed, you're reconsolidating your understanding of reality, and you wake up and you've built yesterday into it, and you do that enough days, then your hallucinations become maybe part of your bedrock reality much more than if you are like, wait a second, I'm seeing or hearing stuff that's not happening. I need to go talk to somebody about this, right? And they're like, oh yeah, that's okay. Like, that's a thing that happens. Like, we're here for you, and that's it, sure they give them pills or something, but and I know that's something that we can separate out, but it also seems like again that need for people to be soothed and make contact with their society once again is an unignorably enormous part of this puzzle.
And isn't that length between onset of symptoms and first treatment in some ways a proxy for how connected you are to a society? Because if you're starting to show some kind of abnormal tendencies or you're, behaving strangely and there's nobody around you to notice and there's nobody around you to actually take you by the hand and like get you to help, then that seems to suggest that you're already experiencing some kind of fundamental disconnection. And so even if you do get the treatment, the prior state is one where you're not really in that kind of nurturing environment.
Yes, definitely. There's no doubt about it. 100%. It's hard in psychiatry. I mean, again, there are always extremes, for sure. But within psychiatry, it's hard to completely disentangle medication effects from other psychosocial effects. You're 100% right.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. This project needs your help. We want to stay forever free of advertisements, sponsorships, various weird interests that want to creep in and tell us the sorts of things that we will be rewarded for paying attention to. We want to serve just you, the audience, but in order for us to be able to do that, we need you to come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and sign up to support the show for just 75 cents a week. And if you don't have 75 cents to give, that's fine. What you can do right now is just hit subscribe before we get back to the conversation. I'll see you there.
I just wanted to excuse myself because I was kind of giggling earlier. It was because when you were describing the borderline types, I was thinking, man, that sounds like literally every artist I know pretty much. And yeah, I might count myself among them, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah. So, you would have all of those what we refer to as ego deficits, but then you would also have to have, well, that's the technical term, of course.
Yeah,
But
fair
then
enough.
they'd also have to be problematic to the point that they really adversely affect occupational functioning, like work, social functioning. So there's always that important caveat.
Yeah, I mean, when it gets to be dysfunctional for me, like I have to spend a day in the woods or something, with some of my best friends and talk it out, I don't know. I don't have a we're very isolated out here in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, basically. And I think that it's in some sense, I think a lot of artists live in some sense similarly, right? Where they're just like alone with their work all of the time. It's very difficult, but they do find a way to interact with society. And I think that's maybe why they fit into the borderline as opposed to the complete hallucinatory.
The complete psychotic.
Yeah, the complete psychotic. There have been plenty of psychotic artists, by the way, let's be honest. But, Van Gogh famously, like you could just go down the rabbit hole with incredible musicians and philosophers, Nietzsche, like people who have just completely gone off the deep end several times, even Jung, right?
Yeah, he had like a full psychotic break when he was writing the Red Book.
But a lot of artists do make contact quite regularly, periodically with the social landscape because that's their conduit. Like that's kind of their role is to make contact in some sense, right? And so I think they do get realigned very easily. I don't know. Anyways, I just wanted to excuse myself because I wasn't laughing at these illnesses. I was just thinking, oh my God, we're all a little bit insane. So.
Oh, no, no, no. You are 100% correct. Social integration is so important in and of itself. It's so, whether someone has like a categorically defined psychiatric illness or not, social integration is so key.
Okay, so this leads us into the other stuff that you've been focusing on, which is the ways in which these social integrations break and how people respond to breaks in that social integration. Because on one hand, you've been studying, mass casualty events, mass murders, and on the other hand, you've also been looking into the way that the new like AI LLM tools play into it. And it seems like in both of those cases, there is a severe break from this social continuity because the paper that you sent us on LLM psychosis was not in the sense of does it induce psychosis, which I think is kind of a difficult thing to test. But you guys did a much simpler test, which was okay, if I write really psychotic things to this chatbot, how does it react? Does it identify that this is a psychotic query and then somehow mitigate or somehow soothe or find ways to distribute that psychic energy. And what you discovered was that no, they tend to just kind of play along. And so what we have right now is we have a story where it's like, okay, you're saying that about 30 years ago, prior to the onset of, social media and this progressive isolation of people from their larger social contexts, there was some light on the horizon. And now, as people have become more fractured, they're entering into these spaces where they have echo chambers of variously damaging either ideologies or just people reflecting their own disordered thinking back at them. And now it seems supercharged because now we have these machines, and the machines are just kind of like, well, I'll just meet you wherever you are. That's totally fine. You want to talk about, the fact that you hear the government's radio signals in your teeth? That's great. We'll do that. And so it seems like the picture that you have for what's ahead of us is pretty grim.
So that's an amazing transition and an amazing way of kind of identifying a common theme among my work. I don't think I could have done that myself, but you are 100% correct. Absolutely. That is exactly the issue. I might not have even thought about it that way myself, but that is a commonality among my work. Incredible. Anyway,
I
what
love
can I
being able to
say?
do that for people.
So social media is very so it's so you would assume social media would be pro-social, but it's extremely asocial. Antisocial, just to clarify again, not to be too esoteric or technical, but I don't use the word antisocial because technically antisocial really means like kind of psychotic. It's kind of more along the lines of being a psychopath. And I guess social media sometimes does induce that sort of behavior. But so asocial is the right word, and that's why I use the word. So social media is actually kind of asocial.
Some might argue it's malsocial.
Right.
Well, the
But
incentive structures are sort of screwy, right?
oh well,
It's,
that's for
I
sure.
mean, I think we could generalize, by the way, in some. I mean, let's start with social media, but it's part of a more general concept of platforms, right? Like ChatGPT
Yes.
is also all of these chatbots are platforms in the sense very similar to social media, and we can start with social media, but they are in some sense an infrastructure that people spend their psychic reality operating within, and they have been for quite some time. But they're not public infrastructure. They're privatized infrastructure, and their goals are private. They are not publicly oriented, right? And this is something that I'm really, really worried about because I freaking love the United States of America as a project. And when I look at the way that this country was set up, particularly, the amendments to the Constitution that were made, basically when the rubber hit the road immediately, they were like, whoa, 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 we got to deal with a couple of things. And the way that they set up a lot of these guardrails was assuming that the infrastructure was a government-controlled infrastructure, essentially, right? So they made all of these really nice safeguards to protect our free speech and our freedom of thought, basically, so that we could actually retool our country as it went along. But the reality is that a lot of this infrastructure, especially the intellectual infrastructure, is privatized now, and it's poorly aligned with the goals of humans is the problem, right? And so it seems like when we think about, well, why are these things why are these bad for us? It's like, it's not because having a place to post interesting ideas and stories and stuff is a particularly bad situation. It's that thing is designed to be an addictive structure that feeds you whatever the heck will make you happy, and the chatbots are no exception, right? They'll just pat you on the back with whatever crazy stuff that you come up with. I mean, they might try to dissuade you barely about some of this, but it seems like that's kind of what your research is feeding into, is that these are designed to sell themselves and to sell their advertisers' agendas, and they don't particularly care about the fate of humanity. And that's weird because the whole project of the United States was like, hey, we need to actually put guardrails in place against that kind of thing. Because obviously governments or authority structures are going to pursue their own interests that are not necessarily aligned with the people themselves. And since we've kind of offloaded all of this to these private companies. It's like, you can imagine a situation. I had this thought when I was going for a walk. I'm really sorry for this digression, but
This is
I'd
great.
love to hear you respond to this. So I was going for a walk this morning, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, I can walk down this road that I'm walking down, and I can be having a conversation with my wife or my buddy or whatever about anything I want, really, right? But if the road was privately owned, there might be people listening to me who are like, you can't talk about that issue on this road, right? We don't do that. This is our road. We own it. And I'd kind of have to be like, well, fair enough. It's not my road. And if I want to walk down it. Now, if all the roads in America were privately built and privately owned, then anybody could tell you what you can talk about in your car when you're driving down the roads, right? And fortunately, that didn't happen for whatever reason. The roads actually have been commissioned and operated by the government. And so a lot of these rights that were imagined by the founders have been maintained on roads. You can talk about what you want in the car, right? To the extent of, plotting a terrorist bombing or something. You can't do that probably, but you can talk about whatever you want. But we don't have those same sorts of rights on these privatized infrastructures that do function as public spaces. Ultimately, there's their infrastructure. Ultimately, right? They're where people go for these things, and that seems like a really, really crazy disconnect that has been stressing the collective psyche of our species, of our country, of the world for quite some time now. And I feel like the founders of the country would have gotten in front of that, because they tried to get in front of it with the infrastructural bedrock, right? The religious constraints and stuff that they were kind of recoiling against. They'd seen derail, let's say, separate the interests of the authorities from the people themselves. And I don't know how we deal with that going forwards without repossessing these infrastructures somehow as a doctrinal affair, a legal affair, almost a public affair.
Yeah, again, the country was designed in a very pro-social manner. Individual responsibility was obviously very important. And then things changed over the past 50 or 60 years, whether it's media or these, private companies, whatever. And that is contributing to a lot of this with social media in particular. Yeah, again, they're much more asocial. And like you said, it's all about motive. Everything is about motive. Like few things are like bad in and of themselves. It's always motive. So like you said, the motive or incentive behind AI or much of the internet or whatever is engagement. I mean, it's like, especially with social media, it's just simply engagement. And obviously that's not like the great incentive or motive, and that's going to lead to bad outcomes. It's simply that, and we're seeing that obviously with now with AI and this the so-called AI psychosis or AI mental health issues. That's why it's so easy for a large language model or chatbot in this case to worsen someone's delusional ideas, instead of rather just telling them, like, instead of just communicating to someone like that, hey, if you're not the Messiah, you're not God, despite what you think. The AI just very easily, without any problems, is happy to reinforce that idea. I share with people about AI psychosis that what we have to understand about artificial intelligence, and large language models in particular, is that the difference between them and in human intelligence, and it's unclear whether this difference will ever be, or whether this kind of like this difference or whatever will ever be bridged, that artificial intelligence doesn't uh, doesn't understand truth or epistemology and eletheology, and it also doesn't understand morality or ethics. You have to be able to understand. Everyone understands epistemology and ethics to some degree. It's inherent. It's just natural. AI does not understand either. Like maybe on a very superficial level, they can give you a level. They can give AI can give you a definition of these sorts of things, but it, AI is not bound by ethics or epistemology. And that is always going to affect how we interact with it. I also use, for example, the example of Narcissus from Greek mythology to describe, again, if we're talking about how AI interacts or AI psychosis in particular. So Narcissus, to remind people, was, I believe, a hunter. He was very beautiful. He was walking by a body of water like a pond or something. He saw his reflection of the pond. He was so like enamored with and entranced by his own reflection because it was very beautiful that he basically stopped doing anything, stopped eating. He just stood there, and he basically just died and became a flower. That's kind of that's the myth. There's like a narcissus flower or something like that. So AI is basically this. It's just a mirror. It's like the pond. It's just showing you what you are, telling it. It's just trying to engage you, just like the pawns or whatever it was engaged narcissists. So it can. Now, I'm very pro AI. There are the many benefits of AI, including within in the mental health field. But we have to be wary about.
I'm pro all of these tools. Like I'm pro platforms too. Like I think having a place like YouTube where you can just make stuff and get it out to thousands of people. I mean, maybe millions if you're really good at it or you really are onto something. I mean, and it aligns with the sponsors. I mean, but in its ideal form, like platforms are absolutely part of the modern world we live in. Like the frontier is not that there's more of the globe necessarily to colonize. It's like it's these space. There's literally a whole new virtual world that's opened up. And so we definitely need these platforms. Not these platforms, but we need platforms for all of these different interchanges to happen. The question really remains for me, who is capable of bringing those back into line with the people's needs, if not a government? Like, what would do that? I'm not looking for Big Brother, but I'm like, why do we organize governments in the first place? It's in some sense to provide for our collective interests, right? I mean, there's a reason that we decided to have the government administer the roads, right? There's a reason for that. And it makes a lot of sense. And we have collective infrastructure now that is not managed by our collective interests anymore. And that can't work out. That just can't work. It isn't working out and it can't work out. And I don't want to say that like that we need, some giant authority to step in, but I want us to be the authority. Like I want the citizens of this country to be the authorities on these things. I want them to have the kind of platforms that aren't going to decay their minds and aren't going to, turn them into narcissists. And I don't know how to pull. I would like to imagine. Or I'd love it if you guys have ideas that are better than regulating it out of existence, because that seems a bit difficult given the current political climate.
Okay, so if we assume that each one of these platforms is basically a mirror, it is like the pond in the forest, then what we are seeing is we are seeing a reflection of this, the current temperature of the psyche of our society, right? And so one of the topics that is one of our special interests is cults. Cults fascinate me because superficially, you look at some weird sex cult or some weird, like the Jim Jones or Heaven's Gate or anything, and you're kind of, or the Rajneeshis, and you assume that well, like all of these people that joined must have been kind of something was wrong with them, or there would be some easy and straightforward way to be able to look at the membership and to be able to identify some deficit that induces them to join. And then if you actually spend time, watching documentaries, reading books about this, you discover that people just get kind of pulled in. And sometimes it is because they're missing something, but it's almost never because they're stupid. Like these are really smart, functional people that somehow just get like pulled into some sort of society that then isolates them from everybody that can tell them that perhaps this is not a good idea. And then obviously the enclosed group eventually spirals out of control and ends either with Kool-Aid or whatever. There was one that we watched which was about this lady who was clearly an alcoholic who was like slowly poisoning herself by drinking colloidal silver. And she had this like very devoted group of followers that just were watching this happen, but none of them could confront her about it.
That one's actually perhaps more disturbing than Jonestown somehow. I don't even I don't know how I can say that, but it really seems like it.
It was called something like Mother God. I don't remember.
Sounds disturbing.
But my point is this, is that it seems like what's happening right now is that we are seeing some reflection of ourselves and we are becoming horrified by it. And the answer that many people float around is like, oh, well, if the government was in charge of these platforms, then maybe like they could change the algorithms and it would somehow surface different things. But I'm like, I spend enough time on these social media platforms that I know precisely what draws people in. And it is these catastrophic, apocalyptic narratives. It is the QAnon, the idea that it's possible to look behind the curtain and see the gears of the machine as they turn. And because you can see the gears of the machine turning, you're somehow part of this, special group. And the fact is that there does seem to be a machine with gears that are turning, which is disconnected from the people themselves. I think that Shiloh's point about the government is, in many ways, it can be reframed to basically say that the interests of this large system have gradually and slowly floated away from the interests of the people that live inside of it. Like, something that stunned me in your book was that you casually mentioned that you see 4 to 5,000 patients a year.
I used to, not anymore, yes, but back in the day, yes.
And I'm like, that's wild. That almost feels like this piece of the story, which is that we live inside of structures that don't really have time for us, because at 4 to 5,000 patients a year, that's like 15, 20 patients a day almost.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that was also when I was working in the emergency room. That's why the numbers were so high. But yes.
But even still, it's like there's this disconnect between people
Sure.
feeling like there is a system that they are connected to, that they have some civic responsibility for, that it moves according to their wills and desires, that their economic situation is good, that they can trust the fact that the roads are going to be repaired, that people aren't going to steal, billions of dollars by committing fraud for like state programs. And so I feel like what we're seeing is we're seeing this massive reflection of the uncertainty, fear, and doubt that people feel in their own lives, because it seems like the project around them is rattling apart. And so the way to fix it, to me, seems like we have to fix the underlying problem, like changing the algorithms on social media to prevent certain things from rising to the top, which is either like, anti-Semitic nonsense or QAnon nonsense or conspiratorial nonsense, or the fact that, Jewish space lasers are starting the forest fires. Like, you're not going to fix the underlying problem. You're going to put a bandage over it. But that same just roiling, like, mass psychosis isn't going to go anywhere. And so the question is, okay, what is a
Just
structure?
to be clear, by the way, I wasn't suggesting that we increase the censorship to solve this problem. I was just like, if they're designed to be maximally addictive right now. They're not, like, I'm not saying they should be designed to be whatever. I'm just saying, like, an open platform seems safer than one that's just designed to keep you on the platform. Like,
What's
if the roads were designed just to keep you on the roads, they would just squiggle everywhere. Like, it would take you like 3 hours to get to the grocery store that's, a mile
Right.
away, right? Because, we got to keep people on these roads to, justify them or whatever. We get money based on how many roads you make. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it does seem like it's easier to build a cult online than it is to build a cult in person. And so I think that maybe the thing that would help fix things is if the machines like shunted people back into the real world as opposed to trapping them in these echo chambers. That's kind of my.
And so are you saying, so what's your solution? You were saying we need to get to the, like, kind of the root of the problem. And what were you thinking is the root of the problem? I'd be interested to hear, just so I.
Well, so there was this book that was written, I think like 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years ago, called Bowling Alone. And it was about the loneliness crisis. And in the first
Okay.
chapter of the book, the author kind of lists the few remaining social spaces where it's, Rotary clubs and bowling leagues and like square dances, like things that people are doing in order to have some kind of connection to one another, given that the church has kind of faded from view. And it's really astounding because in the 20 years since that book was written, almost all of those things have died. Like, movie theaters are closing, third spaces have disappeared. There's nowhere for people to go where they can just socialize with one another. And the platforms trap them. I feel like they drain the social requirement battery, where it's like everybody needs some amount of socializing. And if you can go into your phone and you can socialize with, hundreds of thousands of people, then there's no incentive for you to go out and to actually do something in the world, or to join a club that, maintains the trails in the parks of your neighborhood, or find people that are interested in the same things as you and like get together for game nights or whatever. You do it all online, and so but that's not real human connection. That's some artifice of it. And so if the platforms were more oriented towards helping people come together in person, I think it would solve a lot of the problems, because I feel like insanity is downregulated when people are in a room together with lots of different people, as opposed to just being in this group that's collected on the basis of some algorithmic bubble.
Well, I think what both of you are saying is that to a great degree, a lot of what we're seeing is very cultural. I mean, it's very cultural, 100%. The mental illness epidemic, the crisis, it's very cultural. Like there's no biological reason for mental illness to be increasing. It's totally cultural, 100%. So, and it's very much related to the epidemic of isolation and emptiness and everything else going on. So, I will, as an analogy, I will refer to, you know, I'll refer to, the mass murder and mass shootings, just because that's kind of my area and what I know about. But so what we understand so the major problems societies had for many years and decades were things like war and famine and these sorts of things. So since basically about World War II, society hasn't been confronted with these sorts of issues to any significant degree. Almost all types of violence, for example, have decreased substantially, except for suicide and these mass shootings or mass murder. So, and this, and this is an analogy, but it's very parallel to all these to the mental health crisis and everything else, and the problems with AI and how LLMs affect people. So all these things are parallel, and they probably have a relatively common, I guess, etiology, to some degree. So we're really trying to understand all of this. We identified all of this as beginning basically around the 60s, 70s. So, for example, mass murder of all types, whether with firearms or any other type, the prevalence per capita, the rate was completely stable for just ever until 1970, and then it just started increasing again per capita, and that increase is not even linear. It's more kind of exponential, but it's not linear. It's just the increase is increasing more and more over time. And this is mirroring or kind of paralleling all these other cultural problems we're having. So mass shootings are completely cultural. So kind of what happened in the 70s is all the things that you kind of just mentioned. All these different influences on our lives. Before the 70s, our primary influence, we were very socially connected and integrated. The primary influences on us were, again, other people and teachers and our family and clergy to some degree. And it was around the 70s and 80s when I don't want to just blame media. I'm a big fan of media, obviously. So, for example, I mean, there's great media. This podcast is wonderful. It's obviously accepted. You're kind of like, your types of podcasts are very similar to kind of like what we would watch in the 80s. Like, I don't know whether you would watch, like, I don't know, do you remember Mr. Wizard, for example? This is very much along those like lines. This is like the modern version of Mr. Wizard, and it's totally great and obviously very adaptive. But either way, so it was only, obviously we had television and movies before the 1970s and 80s, but it was only in like the 80s when, we started to have, music television, and we were able to rent movies, and the like movie rentals really only began in like the early 80s. That was really kind of a new thing. And then, of course, that progressed to the internet, and then, of course, social media and everything else. And it's just that our lives are so overly kind of influenced by now these new kind of, again, in this case, we're talking about social media, these other cultural factors, that for some reason it's just been harder obviously, it's been very hard for us to adapt. There are epidemics of isolation and emptiness among especially young people, but also all sorts of older people. And I think that contributes at least to some degree what we're seeing. So, for example, I mean, even if we think about gun control, you know, people say, we've had the Second Amendment forever, of course, and that's totally true. And we didn't have the problems we're having now. So people say it's not the Second Amendment. So I guess technically you can say that. But so what's the problem? So why are people so unable to handle guns anymore? Like, what's going on? I mean, it's very clear, just to be, to be very technical about it. It's very clear that the relationship between weak gun laws, gun ownership per capita, gun manufacturing per capita is so strong. I mean, again, some people, again, back to how people communicate science, there are actually data on this. The data between gun ownership rates and, again, weak firearm laws and violence of all sorts, including suicide, are very strong. But then, yeah, there is this question. We've always had the Second Amendment. Why aren't people responsible with guns anymore? What's the difference? And that's where you go back to these cultural factors that we've been discussing.
I have ideas.
Yeah, let's dig into this escalation of gun violence, mass murder, all of this stuff. That's it for part 1. Please stick around for part 2. There will be a link playing if you're watching this on YouTube. You can just jump right over to it. It's also linked in the description. Part 2 is getting really, really interesting because we are pushing back on the current approach to mental health and imagining something much better that could come for our society in the future. See you there.